So, hello everybody. Before I get started, I just want to give some background. While I was staying at my partner's house in Los Angeles during the pandemic, I wanted to do this piece where I would get a mirror and make it go faster than the speed of light, traveling into the sky away from the city of Los Angeles. And I figure if you get something, I wanted to do this because I figure if you get something to go faster than the speed of light away from LA, it catches up to all this light that was emitted from the city in an earlier time. And so I was thinking, if you could get a mirror to go that fast and catch up to all that light that Los Angeles has produced in the past, you could watch on the face of the mirror time going backwards as the mirror caught up to all that stuff, all that old city light flying through space. And ideally, you'd be able to see Los Angeles like unbuilding itself and people getting younger and rivers flowing upwards. And as for why I wanted to see all that stuff happen, that was the part that I had a hard time explaining with the piece. And so I wrote this sort of long footnote so I could explain it. And then the piece where the mirror goes faster than the speed of light away from the city of Los Angeles would make more sense. Okay. Near the Owens Valley, on the westernmost side of the Great Basin, about 50 miles away from the nearest town, which is called Dyer, there's a hole in the floor of the desert. The hole is formed by a vertical metal pipe, which protrudes about a half-inch above the sand that it's buried in. And so the pipe sits at the bottom of the valley, much like a drain. And the valley itself is about the size of Manhattan. And it's uninhabited except for a small alfalfa ranch that has about 200 head of cattle, and it's also a college called Deep Springs College. And the college has 24 students, and once a year, all 24 of them walk out past the cattle guards into the Nevada scrub brush to the hole in the floor of the desert. And on the walk across the valley, each student picks up a pebble. And upon arriving, they gather around the pipe, all the students with their pebbles, and one by one drop their rocks into the little hole. What happens next is something of a mystery. After the rock is dropped, there's about a 20-second period where you can't hear anything, which feels like a very long time. And then you hear the sound of rock splashing into water distantly echo up the pipe. Both years that I was there and walked out to the drain of the valley, the walk back across the desert to the college was full of chatter and argument over the nature of the pipe. Students hypothesized about whether there could really be a hole in the desert deep enough to let a rock fall for that long. Some students tried to calculate out loud the possible length of the pipe using the likely falling speed of a pebble and the time elapsed before the distant splash. Their answers indicated that the length of the pipe could be anywhere from a little under a mile to 3 miles deep. The more conspiratorially minded students pushed a theory that the pipe was above one of the valley's many underground bunkers and the Soviet seismic stations left from the Cold War Treaty. and that someone was out there under the bunkers, under the pipe, likely someone from the ranch, standing there and catching the pebbles in the palm of their hand, holding them for 20 seconds and then letting the rock fall into a pail of water or something. This theory of someone faking the fall of the rocks was controversial, and if some were unwilling to admit it, I think it shook the conviction of every student involved. And that valley is littered also with tiny seashells. And when walking back across the desert, some students would find them and bring them back to the ranch. One student proposed that maybe the valley used to be an ocean until someone drained the whole thing into some gap in between plates, and that maybe there was a sea trapped in a subterranean cavern beneath the Owens Valley, full of bioluminescent string and blind fish and whatever else survived the day that someone drained the ocean and created a desert. And it bothered me as much as the other students, the question of whether there really was a mile-long hole at the bottom of the valley, or whether it was just a bunker and someone behind the curtain operating the ruse. But at that time in my life, I didn't want to fantasize, I wanted to know. And so I took the steps to find where the hole went, and what I found is probably the greatest secret that I have. And I plan to tell you at some point tonight, but I can't yet because of some things that I want you to imagine, and how they rely on you not knowing. And because if you're going to sit and listen to me, I figure there should be some kind of payoff at the end, and I have a few more things to talk about around the hole in the floor of the Owens Valley, and after that, if you want to listen, I'll tell you what's at the bottom. Okay. So there are a lot of things to know about that valley, which sits on the California-Nevada border in the high desert. It's triangulated by 3 active military bases, including Area 51, and for this reason we would often see strange objects move through the skies at night, some of which left sweeping shades of light in their wake, which looked like the Aurora Borealis, the Northern Lights, and some of which just left off a blast like phosphorus that filled the valley floor with a dim green glow for a few minutes. These sightings were likely just missile tests coming from one of the military bases, but they always made me feel like something supernatural was happening, with the specters left hanging in the sky. This story isn't a ghost story per se, or at least the ghosts that I want to talk about are much more bound to the earth. There's not enough rain to wash away anything in that desert, and everything that lives eventually ends up petrified on the desert floor where it sits for hundreds of years, as there is not enough moisture for anything to rot. In this sense, the desert is blessed with the perfect memory. It is the lack of water that constantly reminds you that that living in the desert is less like living and more like a military occupation. Everything, the rocks, the plants, the scarce and sand-colored wildlife, look at you with a mixture of anger and pity of someone whose space has been invaded, but who also knows just how horrible the mistake you've made to try and live there. The primary reason for the fugitive nature of life in the desert is water, and this speech has its foundation in a realization I had not so long ago on the topic of water. It was one of those realizations that doesn't make you feel profound so much as it makes you feel kind of slow, like you were the last person to notice. But I had it, and it is that water, when given the opportunity, always falls. That's the realization, that water loves to spill. It jumps from clouds with no parachute, and when it finally makes it to the ground, it just keeps falling. Rivers are just crooked waterfalls, always pouring. All of creation began with the fall from paradise, and water is just another version of this story. It falls, and when it hits the ground, it keeps falling. This is especially true in the desert. Water does not just sit there, it is always busy hiding as deep as it can in the ground, or up and disappearing into thin air. This is why everything in the desert bears that look of anger and pity I was talking about, because everything is caught up in the same struggle of chasing water that is always vanishing into the ground, always falling. So this is an especially difficult situation for creatures that can't move. But there are ways of surviving in the desert while stationary. And one possible model is that of the Methuselah tree, the oldest known living thing on Earth. The Methuselah tree is a bristlecone pine, and its story is simple. Sometime about 4,500 years ago, a winged seed pod from a forest that today is long ago submerged or burned down flew over the Owens Valley and landed in a crack in a rock in the White Mountains. A couple decades later, around the time the woolly mammoth went extinct, there was a year of heavy rain, and the seedling split its shell with a sprout. A few centuries passed, and the first recorded alphabet was set in stone in Egypt, and the first horses were domesticated, likely in the Mongolian steppes. And around that time, the sapling grew to be a foot tall. Another 2,000 years, Socrates was sentenced to death, and then Jesus was as well. The tree grows about an inch in diameter every 2,000 years, not including some odd years like 43 AD, where Plutarch, the Roman historian, wrote that the sun was bluish-white and cast no shadows for an entire year. That year, the tree barely grew at all, but it fared better than most plants did, which from the lack of light died, leading to the collapse of multiple civilizations across the world. We don't know the cause, possibly a volcanic eruption and possibly a massive solar event, but all we can hope is that we don't see anything like it in the coming years. Today, the bristlecone's roots have obliterated the rock it once landed in, sending a taproot down to chase the desert water that always has somewhere to be. This is all to say that the bristlecone has a particular response to the scarcity of the desert, and that it is to slow down the process of life on a scale that is incomprehensible to humans. This shift of pace is so unfathomable to us that it might actually be deadly. The curse of the bristlecones is well known in the Owens Valley. There used to be a tree older than Methuselah, known as the Prometheus tree. This was back before core sampling or carbon dating, when you had to cut down a tree to find out how old it was. In the 1960s, a Dutch grad student named Curry found a particularly large tree, and wanting to know how old it was, he hired some loggers from the nearby town of Bishop. The myth goes that when the first loggers arrived, they stood around the tree, started up the chainsaw, and right before they were about to take it down, the foreman yelled at them to stop and said they weren't going to do it, and left. The grad student found a hungrier group of loggers or a poorer group of loggers and brought them to the tree the next day. They did the job, and after its insides were laid bare, they all sat around the stump and counted the rings, showing that the tree was 4,900 years old, nearly 5 centuries older than any other tree they'd found and would find since. One of the loggers died somewhat mysteriously a year later of a heart attack at the age of 34, and someone else, trying to cut a slab from the stump of Prometheus, also suffered a fatal stroke while trying to remove the piece. Another prominent researcher of the bristlecones was killed by a runaway cargo truck on Highway 395, and one current climatologist studying the trees has had to have 3 stents put in his heart, despite being only 45 years old. It's clear that the trees bear an understanding that we have a hard time grasping, maybe fatally so, which is, by my estimation, how to slow down. When I was younger, I had a theory that every creature had the same amount of heartbeats, and that if we could just count how many beats were in a lifetime, we would easily predict all of our lifespans. It's just a matter of how fast you spend them. Humans live for around 80 years, spending their heartbeats at 60 pumps per minute. Hummingbird heart, on the other hand, beats at 1,200 beats per minute, affording the hummingbird 3 to 5 years of life. One of those giant Galapagos tortoises, they live for like 200 years, their heart's beating around 6 times a minute. Maybe it's possible that the bristlecones have a heartbeat as well, just that we've only encountered them between their first and their second. It seems certain, whatever we can know about the bristlecones, it seems certain that that they would outlive us, until we found out a little bit more about them and how they were changing with the climate, which brings us to the tragic irony of the bristlecones. Today, we are getting better and better at reading the rings of these trees, so much so that a core sample of the Methuselah tree was used to construct something called the hockey stick graph, one of the data sets that prove the existence of climate change. The rings respond so precisely to changes in global temperature and precipitation that they essentially are living histories of the fluctuations in climate and CO2 levels. And the decreasing width of the rings don't spell out a pretty future for these trees. Like a ghost who hangs around the site of its murder, shirt still riddled with bullet holes, or a hatchet still buried in its back, the bristlecones have inscribed in their bodies the evidence of the thing that will eventually kill them. The bristlecone pine forest has grown in the rain shadow of the Sierra Nevada mountain range, which runs up the middle of California and whose tallest peak stands at about 15,000 feet high. The Owens Valley between the bristlecones and the Sierras can get as few as 4 inches of rain per year, whereas the western side of the Sierras, including San Francisco and Sacramento, can get up to 150 inches a year. To give you a sense of what it means to live in the rain shadow of a 15,000 foot range, I had a professor who on the weekend used to fly his little rudder plane out over the Owens Valley, get to the top of the eastern slope of the Sierras, if you can imagine this being the mountain. He'd get to the top of the eastern slope of the Sierras and then cut the engine of the plane, and he could glide on the hot desert updraft all the way down over the eastern side of the mountains. And he could cover about half of California doing this. Engine dead, flying only on the dusty wind sweeping up from the desert floor. And for the people who live in the Owens Valley, they've had to figure out other modes of surviving in the desert. Luckily, there's the Owens River, which runs out of the crags and the Sierras, down through the middle of the valley to the Owens Lake. The people indigenous to the Owens Valley, the Paiute tribe, long ago had diverted small parts of the Owens River and used it to irrigate the valley and grow food. So when the first settlers arrived, they pretended to live peacefully besides the Paiute people until they realized that the Paiutes had the best part of the river. And so one night, the whole town set fire to the Paiute houses and drove their inhabitants at gunpoint down to the Owens Lake and into the water to drown or freeze in the sub-zero desert night. Then, surrounding the lake and shooting anyone who tried to swim to shore. By the morning, most of the people in the Paiute tribe sat at the bottom of the lake in the very water that they were killed for. And there's now more discourse around these acts of genocide than there used to be, but what feels strange to me is the schism that's drawn between what happened then and what's still happening today. While the victims sometimes look different now, the Owens Valley is still the site of the same brutal fight, and it seems to me that it is a fight that is only spreading, for many reasons, because of our strange obsession with living in the desert. As Americans, we have, since we got here, been obsessed with conquering the desert, if not changing it completely. We built half the major cities of the West and the biggest desert in North America, the Great Basin. We legislated state-sponsored settler colonialism with laws like the Homestead Act, which encouraged Americans to move west by offering them any land that they'd be willing to farm for dirt cheap. There were some lesser-known policies that attempted to get Americans to settle the desert. In the late 1800s, there was a saying, "The rain follows the plow," which was basically to say that God did not waste water on land that wasn't being put to use, and that if you farmed the land and you were blessed, then God would send rain. People wanted to find out if they were blessed, and so they'd go out to the desert and see if they stood in God's favor. Another widespread theory was that the trees themselves caused rain, a belief held due to the fact that there were a lot of trees in places where it rained a lot. In a somehow even less plausible reversal of cause and effect, many thought that the clouds and loud noises brought the rain, a conclusion which seemed for many to follow from the existence of thunderstorms. So people took to launching dynamite high above their fields, hoping to create some handmade rain clouds to water their crops dying in the Utah deserts. Taken by these ideas, one Protestant legislator wrote the Timber Culture Act to amend the Homestead Act, stating that settlers had to plant trees on 1/4 of the land they settled in hopes of finally bringing some rain to the arid plains of the Great Basin. But people aren't stupid. They don't just come up with this stuff. And as in most cases, there was some rich person spreading misinformation to make a profit. In this case, a number of owners of the Pacific Railroad Company were afraid that people weren't moving west. So to ensure that they could build the biggest railroad network possible, they paid off a bunch of legislators to support the Homestead Act and related bills. A couple of railroad magnates bought out newspapers in eastern towns and published articles that advertised desert states, completely falsifying annual rainfall numbers. One paper printed that Nebraska got 48.8 inches of rain in the year 1888, a number that today we cannot prove wrong, but for a state that rarely gets more than 10 inches per year, the number seems very unlikely. So hordes of Americans flew like bristlecone seeds to land in a crack in a rock, funded by railroad companies who wanted to construct train lines just for the sake of laying track, transporting thousands of people to build desert cities on the promise that rain would come. And when it didn't, people had already given up everything they had and now had little option but to make it work. As I said earlier, there's a lot of ways to survive in the desert, but most of them are only that, survival. Whereas the bristlecones slowed down the process of being alive when faced with the desert, people have historically tended to speed things up. They either flee as fast as they can, or they run in place, moving faster and faster just to keep up with the growing demands of living in a desert. This is especially the case for the story of Los Angeles. The folks who arrived in LA in the late 1800s pretty quickly realized that climate and rainfall was nowhere as attractive as the other big coastal cities, San Francisco and Seattle. Seeing other new desert towns get abandoned after people realized what they were in for, some prominent Los Angeles came up with a plan to make sure the city grew to the point where it couldn't be abandoned. Included in that group was a city government official named Frederick Eaton, an engineer and capitalist named William Mulholland, and a newspaper owner and also capitalist named Harrison Gray Otis. And also, Frederick Eaton was a capitalist. The first part of the plan to make Los Angeles a competitive Western city involved planting rows of palm trees and then buying full-page ads in distant newspapers showing off pictures of a lush LA. the surrounding desert cropped out of the image. The second phase of getting people to come to LA was a little sweeter. They bought some orange groves in the San Fernando Valley north of the city, diverted some water from the city's rivers, and grew the biggest oranges they could. Southern California's sunny but ocean-cooled climate meant that if the land was irrigated, anything could grow there. At the 1898 World Fair, the massive Valencia oranges from Los Angeles, California shocked people into believing the myth of this desert oasis where you could grow anything. So more and more started to head towards the supposed agricultural paradise that was the Los Angeles desert. By the year 1900, the population had doubled from 50,000 to 100,000, and now the city was faced with a new problem. Forget water for growing oranges, the desert didn't have enough water for drinking. But this is where William Mulholland came in, a hydroponic engineer, which was basically a vocation that you had to teach yourself at the time, because it didn't really exist yet. Mulholland decided that if dynamite and trees wouldn't bring the rain, then he would have to go get it himself. The Colorado River was only a couple hundred miles away, but the water was at the bottom of a ravine known as the Grand Canyon, and it would take absurd amounts of energy to get it out of there. The San Joaquin was also close by, but mostly fed to San Francisco, the rival of Los Angeles, a city to which no proud Los Angelian wanted to go begging for charity. Instead, Mulholland had his sights set on a beautiful valley 500 miles north of Los Angeles with a river running down the middle, the Owens Valley. Despite being much further away, and despite the fact that the river sustained the existence of many towns along the banks, the Owens River had one clear advantage. It ran at 5,000 feet elevation, so to get it to Los Angeles, the water would have to do just what water does best. It would have to fall. At the same time that Mulholland set his eyes on the Owens River, another group of state engineers figured out how to tap groundwater from under the city, shooting 20-foot geysers out of the ground and gaining access to an unknown but seemingly limitless quantity of fresh water. It would be enough to supply the whole city of Los Angeles if the city's population had stayed at about 10,000. But when one group of people has the ability to mold public opinion through control of the press, as well as the money to bend the law to its will, as well as the technical capacity to make whatever they do seem like a form of progress, there's very little that anyone can do to stop them. Fred Eaton wanted Los Angeles to be bigger than San Francisco. Otis wanted his newspaper to be the only newspaper in Los Angeles. Mulholland wanted to be filthy rich. Even if Los Angeles did not need the Owens River, due to the newly tapped groundwater reserves, draining the Owens Valley would still help these three men get all of these things. So Mulholland thought back to the scarcely watered orange groves he had bought in the San Fernando Valley in order to grow those huge oranges, and quickly understood that the acquisition of the Owens River could irrigate the entire valley and turn it into a farming oasis, which he could then sell to farmers and developers for millions. Eaton knew that expanding the city into another valley would attract more people and propel the development of the sprawling metropolis that he had always imagined was Los Angeles' destiny. To get the water, all they had to do was con the public and lawmakers into believing that Los Angeles was dying of thirst and needed a new water source immediately. In this way, the creation of Los Angeles resembles the pipe in the floor of the desert that I mentioned at the beginning of this speech. It's a group of people gathering together around an absence. In LA and around the pipe, the people gathered unaware of the nature of the absence, whether the water would run out tomorrow or in 100 years. This threat that the desert makes, that tells you that tomorrow the well may be dry, it makes people live fleetingly, or alternatively, it makes them hoard securities like they might all be ripped away from them tomorrow. It seems to me like no coincidence that Los Angeles is home to some of the most expensive properties and most advanced security systems of all the cities in the world. When living in a state of temporary occupation, as one does in a desert, it makes sense to me that you would want to amass evidence of the opposite. Whether that means rows of planted palm trees, high security compounds in the hills, or draining entire aquifers in order to keep the illusion of growth alive and the lawns green. But back to getting the Owens River for the city that didn't need it. Three men quietly paid off the engineers who had discovered the groundwater, silenced them, and proceeded to buy all of the city's newspaper routes, which back then used to be regulated by the state in order to prevent any one newspaper from having a monopoly on distribution, but in this case did the exact opposite. Then, blocked from the meager water supply going to the San Fernando Valley, when the farmers there stopped being able to grow anything, they sold the land to Mulholland for almost nothing. Then, they started printing headlines stating that the city was to run out of water in 5 years or less, and desperately needed the help of the Owens Valley. The final stage of this process was to clear property on the Owens River such that the city owned all the land that the aqueduct could be built on. This was easy enough, given that the owners of the land were mostly small farming communities which had collectively tended to the irrigated land on the river. Mulholland hired some muscle to break into the Owens Valley Record Department and find out which farmers were the poorest. He then offered them prices that they couldn't refuse and systematically took control of most of the land in the farming cooperatives. He sat on the land, neglecting it, which the co-ops no longer had the manpower to tend to, and then bought up the rest of the land from the farmers who could no longer maintain the Owens River's massive irrigation system by themselves. Mulholland was quoted around the time saying, "The only problem with draining the Owens River to Los Angeles is that there won't be enough trees on which to hang the stubborn bastards who stay." And he was right. In 1903, the Los Angeles Aqueduct diverted the flow of the Owens River, completing the largest water relocation project in modern history up to that point. After the aqueduct was completed and the giant valve was closed, redirecting the water to LA, one of the first things that happened was that the Owens Lake dried up. People who lived near the lake reported a strange smell coming from the dry lake bed, worse than the usual bottom of a lake smell. When they went to investigate, they found hundreds of corpses, the remains of the Paiute tribe, who had been driven into the waters 100 years before. So as I said before, the desert is blessed with a perfect memory, but it's also cursed to remember everything only at the moment of its death. This is a phenomenon that you can witness driving up Highway 395 from Los Angeles to the top of the Owens Valley. The road is well maintained, but is dotted by ghost towns with names like Big Pine, Independence, Cerro Gordo, Amboy, and Lone Pine. The towns are in various states of abandonment, and they certainly have no pines, but the buildings, which would be wood pulp in a place that got more than a few inches of rain a year, are in perfect condition, if a little sun-bleached. The houses there are low and wide. Someone once told me on a rooftop at the first Cooper Union party that I ever went to, that houses are a lot like trees and that you can tell how old they are and how much space they had when they came up, just by looking at how they spread out. She pointed to some 3-story apartments nearby, saying, "Look, those short, wide buildings down there, those were built when Manhattan was just an empty island. And that towering spire, which looks like one room stacked on top of another, that was finished last year. And the only way it could grow was up." The same is true for roots as well. Where there's water, they go shallow and wide. In the desert, roots go straight down. The funny thing about New York is that there's a lot of water, but the roots act like they're in a desert. There's so many plumbing pipes, basements, underground telephone lines, that trees have learned to just shoot a taproot, trying to get past whatever stuff is probably in their way. The roots of an oak tree in the city can apply 5 kilotons of pressure to a seam in a pipe. And if you add up all the new root growth, can grow up to 3 miles of new roots in a day, including all the little hairs that come off the pieces of roots that have hairs. The city spends hundreds and thousands of dollars a year trying to prevent roots from puncturing the tops of subway tunnels or rupturing a main water line by strangulation. This is the price we pay for forcing the roots to live like they're in a desert. The city of Los Angeles also spends an absurd amount of money defending their water line. But instead of sheet metal, they use armed guards to patrol the Los Angeles Aqueduct. After its completion, there were a couple of instances of planted dynamite, which ruptured the aqueduct and spread the water across the desert floor. It was almost as if the railroad magnates who published that misinformation about dynamite bringing back the rain knew that this would prove true at some point. But eventually, the land was too dry and the old farmers were too poor to afford dynamite. And then they turned to a different strategy. A number of folks from the Owens Valley snuck into the main control valve at night, and when the aqueduct guards called the Big Pine police, the cops came, disarmed the guards, and helped the people of the valley turn the massive lever to open the aqueduct onto the desert floor again. That morning, some folks went home, picked up their families and some food, and the people of the Owens Valley cooked breakfast on top of the aqueduct, while watching the water slowly make its way back to the Owens Lake. The Los Angeles police were brought in to remove the families and barbecues, and besides a few bombings in the 70s, that was the last attempt by anybody in the Owens Valley to get the water back. No one can protest anymore because no one can live in a town that doesn't have any water. The city of Los Angeles owns the land under the old ghost towns and collects rent from the companies that charge admission to show off the abandoned houses along the dry riverbed of the Owens River. There's obviously something worse than tragic irony at play here, in part because no one really wins. It reminds me of an old Inuit hunting strategy that I read about once, for when caribou are scarce and when they have to hunt wolves. The hunter takes his sharpest blade and covers it with seal fat, goes out into the tundra and plants his knife hilt down in the ice so that the blade is sticking up straight. And then he goes back to his home. If all goes according to plan, when he's away, a wolf smells the seal fat and comes to the knife. As the wolf starts to lick the fat off the knife, it cuts its own tongue, and the taste of blood and seal fat triggers something in the wolf's head that keeps it from being able to stop until its tongue is in tatters. The next day, the hunter goes, collects his knife, and follows the trail of blood to where the dead wolf lies. And I never know who to root for in this story. Both sides are equally desperate, and given that the strategy doesn't often work, both sides are equally damned in the end. If the Arctic tundra is a kind of desert, then this is a typical desert story, where brutal strategies garner small wins before the desert wipes the slates clean. The city of Los Angeles got a taste of blood and became so rich and powerful that it could acquire whatever it wanted. As we speak, Los Angeles is currently pulling water from the Feather River, an acquisition which nearly caused a full-on war with the state of Arizona. It has 2 aqueducts pulling from the Colorado River, another aqueduct from the Oregon River 600 miles north, as well as its extra supply from the San Joaquin River that it had to fight San Francisco for. The political and social capital that the city now holds means that it can literally do whatever it wants, and what it wants is apparently to grow indefinitely. The water that it got in 1903 condemned the city to a future where it would never stop growing, acquiring more water, creating a massive sprawl that would forever be hopelessly dependent on cars, completely unprepared for the super drought that is slated to hit in the next decade or two, which will cause more suffering than the people in the Owens Valley could have imagined. In this way, the ghost towns of the Owens River are not really ghost towns, they're just skeletons. It's Los Angeles that remains animate, haunted by the very process of water acquisition and rapid sprawl that will make it an insufferable place to live and then an impossible one. Again, like the bristlecones, it bears the mark of its end. People will have to go elsewhere, and with them so will the water. And then maybe those aqueduct gates will open up again, and the Owens River will flow up from Los Angeles and fill the riverbeds beside the empty towns, and LA will live only in the way that it's truly possible to live in a place that dry, perfectly still, heart rate slowed, preserved by the perfect memory of the desert. And so it's about time that I tell you what's at the bottom of the hole that's in the floor of the Owens Valley. A week after all the students went out to drop their pebbles into the pipe, I went out again, not with a pebble, but instead with nearly a mile of twine. I dragged it across the desert and started to lower it into the pipe. After giving it about 10 feet of string, I felt the tension leave. I'd hit the bottom. Someone had been down there, catching our rocks, holding them, making us think that they were falling down a mile-long hole in the desert, going faster and faster, possibly into an underground ocean that had once been drained from the valley, when really the rocks had just been sitting still in the palm of someone's hand. And finally, with regards to the piece where I shoot the mirror faster than light speed and watch time play backwards on its surface, I don't think I actually have to figure out how to do it. The water will flow back up to the Owens River, and the buildings will unbuild. And it's not going to be... The buildings will unbuild. And Los Angeles will play itself in reverse, as people leave for the same reason they came, that the water was falling.